really steered around those three things. Money laundering really is benefit from criminal acts and what we then do with that gain. So we are not only talking about the bag of cash. Yes, potentially the bag of cash paid for a quantity of controlled drugs or firearms would result in being a benefit from crime and therefore be money laundering. But actually we're moving away from that aspect. Within the criminal world and within that criminal element, cash is a huge risk. The aspect of cash creates a huge risk for criminality in trying to get it into the financial sector and move it around. So actually the move away from cash and the move towards assets, virtual assets, properties or other items can all be perceived to be money laundering, whereby we're not just looking at the aspect of the bag of cash. Obviously, there are different levels of money laundering, but money laundering does start at the very basics of receiving a criminal benefit and utilising that benefit, or up to the higher echelons of using shell companies and shelf companies and bouncing monies internationally through offshore financial centres. So there has been a degree of evolution in money laundering, and no, lo and behold, obviously because the world is a much smaller place, it is very easy to move aspects around the world nowadays. Criminality is not governed by the same borders that law enforcement are. So as a criminal group, it's quite easy for me to move funds around the world and leave law enforcement in my wake. So there has been definitely an evolution after in the movement. A lot of that is because of the aspect of international borders and the movement, how easy it is now for us to move money internationally. But that perception of what is money laundering, we must escape the role of the previous terms of placement, layering and integration and look to what is the benefit from crime and what do we then do with that criminal benefit.
Thank you, Andy. Alex, my next question to you is, following what Andy has said, there's one aspect of it which I can't understand, is that the regulatory framework around the world have increased. And secondly, the largest bank, the big multinationals, the HSBC, the Citibank of this world, have got very strong line of defense. Yet regularly we see in the financial press, they are being caught, I won't say with their pants down, but you know, it's quite embarrassing all the time. They get money laundering issues. How do you explain this?
Well, that's a very good question. And it's something that's concentrated the minds of commentators and practitioners since the inception of the FATF recommendations. I can speak from my experience in my own jurisdiction, which has probably one of the most heavily regulated financial sectors in the world. But despite that, the National Crime Agency still estimates that money laundering costs the UK economy £100 billion annually. And recently, this question was addressed by the newly appointed president of the Financial Action Task Force in a keynote speech to the AML Intelligence Global Action on Money Laundering Conference. And he didn't pull any punches in what he said. He was quite stark. He stated that financial criminals are essentially getting away with the bulk of their profits, even though the financial industry and enforcement bodies have the power to stop it. He stated that banks, accountants, company formation agents, lawyers, and others were all part of the problem. If I'm to quote directly from the speech, he said that there's a huge reality gap between the FATF's global standards and the action being taken on the ground. As a result, the criminals are getting away with it, even though it is within our collective power to stop them, because the rules are not effectively enforced. Whilst most countries have put laws and regulations in place, many fail to use them effectively, if at all. He also stated that within the regulated sector, there is a mentality of box ticking, and that needs to change. And there now needs to be a risk-based approach to money laundering. And this is obviously reflected in the current mutual evaluations being conducted by the Financial Action Task Force and their regional bodies. And it is down to the effectiveness of jurisdictions to implement their regulatory and enforcement regimes. It's all very well having the laws and the institutions in place, but the key thing is putting those laws into action and allowing those regulatory bodies and enforcement agencies to take action where appropriate. Essentially, what is required is a collective approach between the regulated sector and enforcement bodies to tackle money laundering, which is now, as Andy indicated, a global problem.
Thank you, Alex. I've made a few notes and I will come back to you on this later on. I would like to just turn to Andy now on one issue. Money laundering is not about whitening illicit activities. It also encompasses tax evasion, over and under invoicing. I won't say these are lesser crimes, but how can banks manage those risks?
Okay, thank you, Afsar. I think the focus is, and just following on from Alex's point around the aspect of the regulated sector working in conjunction with the law enforcement sectors. This is something that is a must in order to ensure that no criminal groups benefit through criminal activity. We must come together in partnership, in unison, to ensure that we investigate and that we report adequately between ourselves. But it is always the case, and it has always been a forethought of ours, that no criminal should benefit from criminality. And as such, we must therefore, and I've heard Alex use this phrase many a time, we must tax the criminal. We must tax that person 100% and take their assets away from them. And we do that utilising whichever aspects are available to us, be that something in the law enforcement arena, through a charge, through a prosecution, a confiscation, or a civil recovery. Or actually, do we look to assistance from the regulated sector by way of banking reports, legislative work that accountancy sectors or legal sectors can undertake to assist us? Criminal groups will not only work in laundering large sums of money, they will also work in the fields of tax evasion. They will work in that aspect of, you called it over and under invoicing, I might refer to that slightly as trade-based money laundering. But they will work in those different elements whereby they will undertake different roles and different regimes in order to launder their funds. The banking sector are certainly, and the financial sectors are the first line of that defence. For them to undertake and ascertain and spot those aspects of suspicion and report that, then we can then look to prosecute, we can look to investigate, we can look to infiltrate early. It's almost like, Afsar, what we call the low-hanging fruit. If we can pick up the lower-hanging fruit, we will hopefully be able to lead on and stop your larger organised crime groups, because the crime groups are not only dealing in large-scale money laundering, they are also dealing in both smaller items of over and under invoicing, of tax evasion, and other aspects like that. So I think it's that joint approach that we must use and come together to ensure that there isn't a benefit from criminality.
Andy, just to follow up on your answers, these days when we look at any legislation or any write-up on money laundering, we tend to also continue the sentence by adding terrorism financing and arms proliferation. You will understand that probably in this part of the world, we are not very familiar with terrorism financing and arms proliferation. How exposed do you think a jurisdiction like Mauritius is, and what we need to do to mitigate those risks?
Yeah, thank you for that, Afsar. I think, yes, terrorist financing and money laundering always go hand in hand internationally on their legislation. There are distinct differences, obviously, in relation to money laundering. The ultimate game of the money launderer is to ensure that the dirty money is clean, that it becomes used, that we can now buy the Ferrari, we can use the money to get assets, etc. There is a distinct difference between what the end game is for terrorism financing and arms proliferation, and that really is the distinct differences. But how they undertake that, how they undertake their roles, are very similar. The criminal groups will work side by side, hand in hand, and as previously said, they will undertake different aspects, not only just the aspect of money laundering, but the lesser offences as you so referred to. In relation to the aspect of terrorism financing, we do see elements whereby it may be smaller connected, there may be charity organisations involved in that, and we would then be looking to the regulated sector to assist us around the way that they act on customer due diligence, enhanced due diligence, and ensuring that beneficial owners and source of wealth is correctly identified, to ensure that there isn't that crossover and that any degree of criminality that is stepping into the world of terrorism financing or money laundering is correctly identified very quickly and reported upon. Unfortunately, Afsar, there is a distinct crossover whereby terrorism financing and money laundering does go hand in hand. Do I see it as a big risk in Mauritius? I hope not. I hope that we as internationally are winning the fight against terrorism financing, because as much as money laundering hurts us economically, terrorism financing is a much bigger thing.
Thank you, Andy. Alex, you have been dealing with Mauritius jurisdiction for a while. You have seen the evolution of the regulatory framework. Can you just give us your appreciation of what Mauritius has done so far?
Well, Mauritius has taken very positive steps in developing a robust regulatory anti-money laundering and counter-financing terrorism regime and framework. There are several bodies within that are tasked with regulation and enforcement. Just to name a few, obviously the Bank of Mauritius, the Financial Services Commission, Gambling Regulatory Authority, and the Institute of Professional Accountants, to name just a few. All of these bodies have a very important role to play within this framework, in regulating their specific sector, and where appropriate, taking enforcement action under the Financial Intelligence and Anti-Money Laundering Act. On the enforcement side, then, when we move towards law enforcement and prosecutorial bodies, we have the Financial Intelligence Unit, Independent Commission Against Corruption, Police, and the Director of Public Prosecutions. All have taken action in the past to investigate and prosecute money laundering. In actual fact, that was noted in the last mutual evaluation report, where it said that Mauritius has used its legal and institutional framework to investigate and prosecute money laundering offences, and it has actually got some very notable case decisions on how money laundering is dealt with. However, what the assessors did look at was actually the rate of investigation and prosecution compared against the risk profile of the country. And as an international offshore jurisdiction, they were suggesting that there should be more enforcement action taken on both the regulatory side and also on the criminal side. That is not an easy problem to address. But as I said earlier on to your previous question, so what is required is a collaborative approach between both the public and private sector in dealing with that. Everyone has a role to play who works within the regulated sector and the enforcement sector in dealing with money laundering and terrorist finance.
Alex, you may be aware that we have set up a financial crime court, but yet we haven't seen many prosecutions locally. Can you probably shed some light why we haven't seen many prosecutions locally?
Well, just to take that question head on, there have been prosecutions for money laundering under Section 3 of the Financial Intelligence Anti-Money Laundering Act. And as I just mentioned, Mauritius has got one of the key decisions in how money laundering is investigated and prosecuted, and one which I've used in international training for some time. It gives a very firm footing as to how investigators and prosecutors deal with the offence. But the issue around money laundering is that it is a very complex one. It's not an easy thing to investigate, because often the crime that you are looking at is far removed from the original crime that created the property that Andy was talking about in his initial answer to you. And where it becomes further removed from the initial predicate offending, the harder it comes for investigators and prosecutors to prove that. Often criminals will move money across international borders, and therefore you are looking at obtaining evidence from other countries, which in itself faces significant problems. However, that being said, from the engagement that we've been having with Mauritius, in particular those law enforcement bodies, there is a clear determination for money laundering to be identified and investigated. And as Andy said, what I like to do is to tax the criminals and take their assets away from them.
Thanks, Alex, for those encouraging words. Andy, how do you see the future trends in enforcement action in respect of money laundering and terrorism financing?
Yeah, thank you, Afsar. I think in relation to future trends, one of the things that I talk about quite a lot when I speak both nationally and internationally is the focus being on assets rather than the focus being on conviction and what we call prison time, really. I don't know what the prisons are like in Mauritius. I hope I never get to find out what the prisons are like in Mauritius. Certainly within the United Kingdom, it almost looks, and my opinion, and I've got to say it's my opinion because there is a degree of reform and rehabilitation that is ongoing, but ultimately the focus is moving away from the aspect of trying to prosecute someone and obtaining a lengthy custodial sentence. Instead, we are looking at the assets, and we must focus on the assets and look towards asset recovery in conjunction with, if not apart from, a prosecution and conviction leading to a prison sentence. So I think in relation to future trends, the aspect of future trends is that the trend has got to be that we must push towards asset recovery. We must investigate the assets, we must recover those assets, and we must then get those where we can utilize them for compensation of our victims, or ensure that they are stripped away from criminality and used for good, that they are used in different aspects and different roles. The focus on civil recovery and moving towards civil investigation, away from criminal prosecutions. But again, we have a big push around civil recoveries because that way we are stripping the assets. Afsar, in my opinion, if I was to line up 100 victims in the street and say to them, do you want your suspect to go to prison or do you want your money back from the fraud? Then I think we would be in the very high 90% of people saying, I want my money back. I don't think people are interested in people going to prison. They want to be compensated for their loss. They want to get their money back and returned. So I think a lot of the future trends in law enforcement is moving towards the aspect of asset investigation, and certainly the big push, not only from ourselves, but Financial Action Task Force by the EU, is the aspect of asset management, asset recovery, and focusing on those assets.
I've got a bit of a crazy question to both you and Alex, based on the answers that you have been giving us. From what you're saying is, we should let people committing the crime launder their money, then we go after them, as opposed to we should stop them from laundering the money in the first place. This bit is a little bit unclear to me.
So my stance is no, we shouldn't let them launder the money. If we can get in nice and early, the earlier we can get in, the better. And actually, when I personally, my personal opinion is, if we can find a regulatory breach that will allow us to take the assets, then we can look towards a regulatory breach. So if there is something in the financial sector, something in the legal sector, something in the accountancy sector that will assist that there is a breach that can be looked at, then I think you can almost attack a crime group very early rather than allowing them to commit laundering further and waiting for the proceeds. Alex, what's your thoughts on that?
No, I agree. I mean, if we have a robust regulated sector, then that will try and prevent money laundering at source. However, if money laundering is taking place, then equally law enforcement bodies need to be in a position and have the powers to investigate and then bring appropriate action against them. I'm slightly a bit different to what Andy said. Whether they go to prison, okay, that may well be a result of committing the offence, but what really hurts criminals, and particularly organised crime groups, is taking the assets away. There are many cliches when it comes to dealing with proceeds of crime, such things as money is a lifeblood of crime. But the unfortunate thing is those cliches are true. It is the lifeblood of crime. So if you take away that source and take away that funding source for them, then it has a massive impact upon their activities and future activities.
Let me put you on the spot. I mean, both of you. If somebody walks to a bank with a suitcase of $1 million, a good bank would say, no, we can't take it. You can't show us proof of fund, blah, blah, blah. You turn the guy away. Or should we be saying, take the money, then report the guy to the authorities, at least he gets arrested? and you have basically caught him as opposed to turn him away. I mean, which one is the preferred option? You catch the guy or you turn him away?
Afsar, I'd like them to pick the phone up while he's actually stood at the bank with the bag of cash. So that would take away all the options. It's a difficult one, is that because if the bank are doing their checks on source of wealth, beneficial ownership, background information, customer due diligence, and they don't agree that that money has come from a correct source, then they should effectively turn it away and submit a suspicious transaction report. But in doing that, there is now potential that we would also lose that value. So those monies would now be lost, whereby there could always be consideration that if the checks are done and the background wealth cannot be undertaken, that the bank could take the cash, could bank the cash and still submit the report, and in turn submit a request as a defence against money laundering to say we did this to secure the assets and flag that to law enforcement. But that would always be on the policies of the bank and the regulations decided by those at the banking sector as to whether they decided to turn away or whether they decided to almost act as law enforcement, but almost seizing the money, placing it into a bank account and then reporting on it. Alex, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think what you said is right. It is a very difficult situation, but I would prefer the bank to ring the police as the person standing in front of them with a bag of cash, because that in itself is highly suspicious as to why someone would be walking into a bank with that amount of cash. Or alternatively, as Andy said, if the compliance is done appropriately, then the appropriate route is to make the suspicious transaction report, notwithstanding the fact the money has been banked. At least in that way, the money is then secure, and then the investigation then can take place after that.
But after filing the STR, what can a financial institution do?
There's quite a lot to do for the financial institution. Ultimately, we're not just looking at a financial institution submitting a basic STR, a basic suspicious transaction report, saying Afsar Ebrahim attended the bank and paid £1 million or $1 million into the bank. We're looking for descriptions on how the person acted, their mannerisms. We're looking for descriptions of the cash. A lot of money laundering occurs internationally in the same forms and the same patterns. And actually, those aspects, that cash, I personally would want to see that cash retained in its original format. If the bank were able to hold that for law enforcement to then come and view, there can be perceived patterns and the way that packages are undertaken, which would suggest a degree of criminality and would assist law enforcement. In relation to suspicious transaction, we're looking at the money laundering reporting officers doing their own little bit of research, having a look at the open source data. What do they know about this client's history? What do they know about his previous source of wealth? What companies he related to and what bank accounts? And all that background information and that intelligence would really assist a law enforcement investigation moving forward.
And looking at the new trend, people are talking a lot about cryptocurrencies. Are they really the currency for the mafias?
Afsar, do you want me to answer that in one word or in a sentence? Is cryptocurrency a mafia currency? No, completely not. If it is, then both Alex and I are involved in the mafia. And I don't think we are by any shadow. Cryptocurrencies and the use of virtual assets is just the next movement forward. At the moment, we are all in the aspect internationally whereby we all understand fiat currency. We understand that paper and that coin. We know how it is in our hands. We know we can take it and we can exchange that piece of paper, that coin, for a coffee, for a beer, for our groceries. We understand that process. But in relation to the aspect of cash, physical cash, cash is just exploited by criminals. Criminals exploit the use of cash. They use it to buy drugs. They use it to buy firearms. They use it in terrorism financing. They use it to commit fraud. As we have moved forward in our lives, we've gone to internet banking. We use tap-on Our cards are tap on. We don't carry cash. We use Apple Pay. We use our watches, our mobile phones to make payments. Virtual currencies and cryptocurrencies is just another step forward. And actually, the aspect of, is cryptocurrency a mafia-based currency? No, it's not. Completely not. It is just a currency. It is a value. It is a means of exchange. It can be exchanged for goods, services, etc. The problem that virtual currency has faced is that the news stories which have surrounded it have related to things like Silk Road. I've related to its criminal exploitation. So it is just the fact that actually virtual currencies are just exploited by criminality. Yes, there is a huge push around this from the Financial Action Task Force in their recommendation 15 and controlling virtual asset service providers and ATM users. But we are doing no more with virtual currency than we have always done with cash. We have controls for cash. We just need to have the same controls around virtual currency. It's not a mafia currency at all. It's just unfortunately been exploited and got to a point whereby a lot of news stories are linked to it and a lot of frauds as we move forward. I presume if most people checked their spam on their email now, there would probably be a Bitcoin, invest with me and I'll make you a Bitcoin millionaire tomorrow. So it's started to get that little bit of a grey area, but it's completely not linked to mafia now.
Andy, I've just got a message from one of the participants who asked me to tell you that there's a program on Netflix on the prisons in Mauritius. So when you have time, tune in.
I'll definitely pick that up, and it's on Mauritius. I will definitely pick that up. Thank you for that. But there is definite use of virtual currency in Mauritius. Completely, there is definite use in your region and your jurisdiction.
Even though it's not illegal tender.
It's not illegal to use, Afsar. It is not illegal.
Okay. But a lot of financial intermediaries like PayPal, Visa are using it. I mean, what banks need to do to strengthen their defense against this?
I think banks just need to have the level of understanding. Banks will move forward. That our financial institutes will 100% move forward. They will look at aspects like the blockchain. They will look towards virtual currencies. They will look to have a bank-owned digital currency. A lot of jurisdictions around the world are creating their own digital currencies. Banking sectors are developing their own digital coin. Banks are creating accounts whereby you can hold virtual currencies. And there is a distinct push towards the public blockchain ledger around different aspects, including within the banking sector. I think what the banks need to do is, one, we all need to adhere to recommendation 15, as that is brought in by the Financial Action Task Force. So we must look to have controls around virtual asset service providers, or those providing an exchange facility, or those providing Bitcoin ATM services. So we must have those regulations in place. We must look to not only move forward as a jurisdiction by ensuring that we move with the times, we will move away from fiat currency in time. So we need to move into that element of blockchain and virtual, but also we need to ensure that we protect our clients and our customer base, because not all our customers will understand blockchain technology. They won't all understand virtual currencies. So I think as a banking sector and within those financial elements, it's almost that we are bound a little bit to assist our clients in understanding by producing material and documents to allow them to read and understand virtual currency for themselves and provide that level of understanding. So as the jurisdiction or internationally we move forward into the world of virtual currency, there is then a clear understanding rather than any risk.
Alex, a lot of people who are involved in money laundering often use professionals as intermediaries. And even some of the FATF issues have been on, professionals not being well regulated. How do we manage this so that, we can increase the level of awareness or, and what professional needs to do to be able to stay compliant?
Well, everyone involved in the regulated sector has a role to play, as I mentioned earlier on. No matter what sector you are in, you need to have your own anti-money laundering and terrorist financing policies and regulations in place. It is for, depending on the size of your organization, it is for them to basically have those policies and procedures in place and make sure that their staff are fully aware of it. So particularly if you look in the banking sector, the compliance officers, the money laundering reporting officers, they have a vital role to play in ensuring that their procedures and policies are put into practice and in place. Andy was talking earlier on about some future trends in enforcement, and one thing I can definitely say will be that I think there will be a much more of an increase in enforcement action being taken against the regulated sector, not only through regulatory penalties being imposed upon them, but the UK has recently seen that the Financial Conduct Authority have instituted criminal proceedings against NatWest Bank. And those proceedings relate to their failings in having, or their failings in dealing with their own internal policies, which were put in place to comply with anti-money laundering regulations. And incidentally, the NatWest Bank will be appearing in court this week for the initial hearing on the 14th of April.
So, if I can just add a line onto that, there is a distinct risk for professionals in the financial, the banking sector, the legal sectors, and in the accountancy sector from criminality. Because as a criminal group, if I am looking to launder, then it would be great and it would greatly assist me if I have got a professional on board. If I have got someone who professionally can assist me in that laundering process, it will help my laundering. It will ensure that I can turn illicit funds into clean funds very quickly and very easily. It will assist me in getting my criminal monies into the financial sectors. So our professionals are at risk. And as a criminal organised group, criminal groups will look to those who aren't adhering to their policies and procedures, who aren't adhering to the correct regulations, and then try and get those involved in their acts of criminality. So I think as a regulated sector, the policies are there to not only assist and detect, but are there to protect ourselves in that regulated sector, to protect our professionals so that our professionals do not become victims themselves.
Thanks, Andy. That's very reassuring. Why do you think it's still difficult to prosecute? I mean, Alex was talking about NatWest Bank going into court. Why does it take a long time to be able to get a prosecution on money laundering? From your explanation, it seems that money laundering is a clear-cut, it's not like a black or white. Why is it difficult? Why do we move in gray areas and make prosecution so difficult?
Well, I suppose as an ex-prosecutor, I would say that prosecutions are brought to a high standard. It is for the prosecutor to prove to a standard that the jury or the judge is satisfied, so that they're sure that the person has committed the offence. But the difficulty with money laundering is, particularly when you are looking at third-party enablers who are not doing self-laundering, as I said earlier on, they are far removed from the original predicate offence. But as I mentioned, Mauritius has quite a strong line of case authority that will provide guidance to investigators and prosecutors as to how they should address this issue. What is required under the Financial Intelligence Anti-Money Laundering Act for the offence under Section 3 to be proved is that evidence must be obtained to show that the money or property has derived from crime, and that the person who is dealing, converting, transferring, depending what action is being brought, that they knew or had reasonable grounds to suspect that the property had derived from crime, which is a very wide definition. So it's not only knowledge, it's also reasonable grounds to suspect, which if you're working in the regulated and professional sector, that's something that is a big risk for those working within that sector. But the key case that Mauritius brought, which went to the Privy Council, so it's the highest appeal court authority, basically reinforces a Court of Appeal decision in the United Kingdom. So in proving that the property has come from crime, the prosecution can do it in two ways. They either identify the predicate crime from which the property has come from, or they look at the circumstances in which the property was dealt with And they would say that these circumstances give rise to an irresistible inference that it has come from crime. They don't even have to particularize which crime it was. It's just crime per se. Now, whilst that may seem to many lay people that's a very easy way of prosecuting money laundering, it's not. It's still a difficult task because the investigators and prosecutors must gather a lot of circumstantial evidence, which can be difficult, particularly when you're looking at evidence held in other jurisdictions, evidence held across the regulated sector, evidence held across many different government departments, etc. So it is still a complex issue. And I think it has to be. The prosecutions have to be brought to a very, very high standard. So, as I've mentioned before in many answers, the way to address this is the multi-agency approach. And that is the key area of assistance that Andy and I are trying to provide to law enforcement and prosecutors in Mauritius, is to have that joined up multi-agency approach in identifying, investigating, and then ultimately prosecuting and recovering the proceeds.
Very interesting. I mean, I just have one comment. You don't need to answer it, but when I hear you, it's all the money laundering are happening in the largest economies and where all the big banks operate. But it's unfortunate that it's only the emerging markets that are on the grey list. Anyway, Andy, just one.
Afsar, it is, yes. That's a strange aspect, isn't it? But all this money laundering occurs, and yet it's only the emerging markets that are on the grey list. Yes.
And Andy, we're all working from home because of the COVID. Does this facilitate the criminals?
Unfortunately, Afsar, it's created some distinct hurdles in the law enforcement arena. Certainly, there has been an increase in frauds internationally, whereby actually I'm sat here now. I'm in my house. I'm sat with a laptop computer. A lot of people on the conference will be sat at home with a laptop or a standalone computer. If I'm actually a criminal, then I could actually commit crime sat in my bedroom, sat in my office, anywhere in the world. I don't have to go out with a balaclava on my head and try and rob a bank or commit a robbery or a theft. I can sit and I can send out emails. I can send out ransomware attacks. We have seen a huge increase in that sort of aspect internationally. And unfortunately, you're then at the process of, if I'm sat in the UK and I've attacked Alex, who's sat in Barbados, he would report that to his law enforcement agency in Barbados, who it's going to create a huge problem for them to try and investigate that for somebody who's now international, and can we recover the assets? So it's certainly increased crime based through computer-based criminality. There has obviously been the aspect of virtual currencies has greatly increased during the pandemic. So the value of virtual currencies has taken a huge rise, which again has prompted a huge amount of external emails and junk emails into investment frauds and things like that. So unfortunately, yes, we have seen an increase in criminality, cyber criminality, and a drop away from that aspect of standard crime. Because if you're locked at home, you can't commit standard crime. You're in the house. But as such, that creates us the hurdles that we have, whereby we are then more looking towards the regulated sector in assisting and identifying those suspicions, and almost being able to step in if a victim is the victim of something like a ransomware attack or the victim of a romance fraud, for example. If the regulated sectors are aware of these types of fraud and these types of trends and patterns that are being utilised by our organised crime groups, then they can step in and assist their customers in not becoming victims.
Thanks, Anne. And Alex, in the same sort of thought process, what about mobile money? Because this case cries to probably more split transactions. And is mobile money exploited for money laundering, or is it safer?
any way in which assets or money can be used or be exploited. It's just the nature of the beast, I would say. As Andy's mentioned, the main goal of criminals is to legitimize their assets and their money. So if they can find a way of doing it, yes, they will. And when he mentioned earlier on talking about crypto assets and said it wasn't the currency of the mafia, but unfortunately it's just a new area which is being exploited by criminals. If they can find a chink in the armor, as it were, they will then use it. I was asked the question recently, does a bank-to-bank transfer mean that it's not money laundering? The answer to that is no. There is always a risk that it will be. In many ways, a well-regulated, well-policed or enforced regime is attractive to criminals, because if they're able to move the money through that, it gives that perception that it is from legitimate means and sources. So, unfortunately, to answer your question, probably doesn't guarantee that it's safe, but it will be something will be exploited by organised crime.
Afsar, I think further to that, the good aspect that we have around the movements away from cash and the movement to mobile money, banking transfers, virtual currencies, is that these things are traceable. There has been many publications years ago about cash is king and follow the money. Well, actually, in relation to cash is king and follow the money, if criminals are dealing in physical fiat currency, it can be difficult to follow the money, because a lot of the time the physical cash does not move, only the value of that moves. Whereby when we start to look at mobile money, banking transfers and virtual currencies, these are things that with a degree of understanding, with a degree of training and being able to navigate things like the blockchain, we can trace, we can track, and we can present that both in regulated outcomes, civil investigations or criminal prosecutions.
Andy, earlier, if I recall, when I was talking to you about overend invoicing, you call it trade financing laundering.
Trade-based money laundering.
Trade-based money laundering. Does the solution to trade-based laundering is through blockchain?
Yeah, I definitely think the aspect, if we could move towards blockchain around trade-based, around trade being moved around the globe, it wouldn't take away the aspect, it wouldn't stop the aspect of trade-based money laundering, but it would certainly make it a lot easier to follow, a lot easier to track and trace. With trade-based money laundering, internationally, there is a large amount of trade moving around the globe. And unfortunately, our criminal groups will step in and try and infiltrate that by asking companies to over-invoice or to under-invoice or to make those payments for them. And this is just a way that the criminal groups are able to informally move the value from one jurisdiction to another. I think, Afsar, it's a really good point you make around blockchain. Blockchain would really assist us in a lot of different aspects as we move forward. And in relation to the movement of trade globally, that would be a really good aspect. We would then see an element whereby we could trace a lot easier.
I think as a follow-on question, you and Alex were mentioning that money doesn't need to move. It's the value that moves. Is this where the shell companies come into equation? When you say the money doesn't move, but just the value, this is where people are using shell companies? Or what's your definition of shell companies being an instrument for money laundering?
So I think shell companies have their need in international trade. There is definitely a need for shell companies to be apparent for international trade globally. If you are dealing internationally, it may be the fact that you need to trade in another country very, very quickly, that you need that credit history, that you need that background, that you need that jurisdiction, but you need to be able to have movement from your jurisdiction to another. And shell companies will assist you in establishing yourself and being able to move and continue to trade internationally. Unfortunately, like all things, shells are then just exploited. In relation to the aspect of the movement of value, yes, this is it, the element whereby value will move from A to B to C without physically moving, and criminals will just jump in and fill the gap. Alex, anything on the shells? You've worked in a lot of financial centres.
Well, yeah, I mean, as Andy said, that obviously shell companies have a legitimate use, but again, as I mentioned earlier on, any opportunity that a criminal or organised criminal group have got of legitimising the activities that they're doing and the funds that flow from that, then they will exploit it. And it is then for jurisdictions which have shell companies or the offer the services for such companies to be purchased or to be used, to have the appropriate regulation in place to make sure that the background checks are being done, particularly when it comes to the UBO, the ultimate beneficial owner. But as I said, if there's any way that they can exploit it, they will.
But if a bank suspects a transaction or suspect a client to be involved, they have filed the STR, and now they get a request to close the bank account, and the funds are being transferred to London. Should a responsible bank let the transaction happen because it's a hassle going away, or should they stop the transaction and inform the authorities?
Clearly the latter. It should be something that they should inform the financial intelligence unit about, and for them then to take the appropriate action. It will depend on which jurisdiction you are in, and it will depend on what the laws are. I've worked in some jurisdictions where they have a consent regime, and then the FIU will refuse consent and the money cannot be moved. It will depend on the domestic legislation as to what powers the FIU have and what they will do. But certainly I certainly wouldn't advocate transferring the money in a way of transferring the problem. It's something that, as I said, everyone has a responsibility to deal with these issues, and the bank should really be reporting that to the FIU and allowing the FIU to take the appropriate action.
Okay. I know personally of a case where a bank did take cash above the minimum threshold, did all their due diligence, and were satisfied that the money was correct, clean. They banked the money, but they still file an STR and inform the authorities. At the end of the day, they end up getting fined. What should they have done differently?
So the bank did their checks. The bank ascertained that they were happy with the source of funds, the beneficial owner, etc. But the funds were above the amount, so they therefore submitted a suspicious transaction report. And did you say that they then received a fine in respect of that investigation?
Yes. A small fine, but they still, they still got taken to task.
Okay, that's a difficult one without knowing the full circumstances of that case, because the way that you describe it to me is, and what we would expect to see a banking sector, someone in the financial sector doing, is when that person comes in with that set amount of cash, that they do the background checks, that they ascertain the source of wealth, the beneficial owner, that they do the checks that they need to do, be that be open source, questioning the client, etc. And ultimately, because the value was above what it should have been, to then submit a suspicious transaction report within the designated timing to do that. This is what we would ask the banking sector to do. So without knowing the full circumstances, Afsar, it's a difficult one, because I would say they've acted as appropriately what they should do. If they've made the right checks, if they've submitted the suspicious transaction report within the right time, then I don't understand where the fine has come from. I'd need a little bit more on that one, I think, to be able to then defend and assist the bank. Alex, I don't know if there's anything further is there on that.
We'll share with you next time you come. Alex is shaking his head.
Yeah, Alex is agreeing with me. I think next time we're in Mauritius, Afsar, I am more than happy to sit down with that case with you, and let's see if there is anything that I can point out.
There is a lot of, I would say, hammering on UBOs. These days, whatever you do, whatever work we do, the amount of time in putting the UBOs on board is a very tedious process. How much of this UBO is critical in the money laundering fight?
absolutely critical, because when Andy went back to the age-old definition of money laundering, he mentioned that the process of layering, that's all part of that process. And when you are investigating a case of money laundering, trying to find the ultimate beneficial owner can be a very, very lengthy task, particularly where you have companies owning another company, registered in another jurisdiction, etc. So it is absolutely vital, particularly for law enforcement, to have quick access to information that will reveal the ultimate beneficial owner.
I guess it's even more difficult in real estate. How do you manage that in real estate? Because the layering seems to be quite a bit when selling properties. How do you protect yourself against this?
I think in the regulated sector, you protect yourself by taking as many steps as is necessary. We know that criminal groups are good at what they do, and let's be fair and let's tell the truth. We don't catch all criminals around the world. In fact, there will be a lot of very, very successful criminal groups who have managed to launder and get away with assets for many, many years. And that will continue after that. There will always be people we don't catch. But in relation to the aspect of, for example, properties, we need to try where we can to ascertain who is the ultimate beneficial owner of that property and that asset. But we take all steps available to us. You will have people on the call, I am certain, from the estates agencies, from the legal sectors, from notaries, and it's almost, you gain almost a little bit of a spidey sense. If something's not quite right, you take that further step, you have another step. When you are satisfied under your own aspect that you are satisfied that the ultimate beneficial owner has been identified, then that's as much as you can do. If it's the fact that there is another layer and another process that you have missed, as long as you have satisfied and you have taken all reasonable steps that you should take and justified those steps, then you can never be criticised for that. We can't expect everyone to ascertain absolutely everything. It will never happen around the world, but we take what steps we can.
Thanks, Andy. I think it's time to just focus on some of the questions that are being put through by the audience. Most of the questions, I'll be honest with you, are on the issue of blacklist. I'm not sure they're referring to the blacklist or to the movies on Netflix, but anyway, the issue is how can a jurisdiction like Mauritius do more than what already being done? A lot is being done, but you know, it seems to be it's still not good enough.
Just before Alex jumps in to give an answer, what I do want to say on this point, Afsar, is it's not an overnight answer. You know, we're not. I think as a jurisdiction, Mauritius are taking some really good steps, some really positive steps, and going in completely the right direction. But it doesn't just come overnight. The other problem that Mauritius has got is that this has all happened during a global pandemic, where everything is just a little bit slower. And, you know, we need to not only, in Mauritius, it's not only about ticking the boxes, it is moving forward positive as well. And I think it's really the positive steps that are ongoing in Mauritius are huge. So I would just encourage people to say Mauritius is going completely in the right direction, but it just doesn't come overnight. Alex?
No, I agree. And I think the key here is, as I mentioned earlier on, with the current round of financial action task force evaluations, is all about effectiveness. And it's very difficult to prove effectiveness overnight, because you have to obviously show results. You have to show the results of regulatory action. You have to show the results of enforcement action. You have to show the results of prosecutions and asset recovery. That is not going to happen within weeks. That will take some time. But what Mauritius has done is to set up various committees and task forces to look at the comments that have been made in the last evaluation report and to try and address them head on, which is exactly what they should be doing. And that then should be able to show that the assessors that the right steps are being taken to address the issues that have been highlighted.
Excellent. That's very encouraging to hear. I have a very long question, but interesting one on cryptos. If banks do not embrace the change to cryptocurrency, are they likely to become obsolete in the future? Because you don't really need a bank account to operate a virtual currency. And what are the implications on money laundering with virtual currency?
Do you want me to answer that one, Alex? Right, so let's just try and break that down a little bit. Are banks going to become obsolete? No, banks won't become obsolete, because we won't all move towards virtual currency, and we won't all move towards that aspect. Banks internationally are developing their own digital currencies, so they are almost competing in that same market anyway. Quite interesting, Afzar. I posed this as a question to university students some time ago, in the aspect of, will we become a cashless society? Will we become a cashless society? And I think at some point we will become a cashless society, but I think not in the near future. So I think we are a long way away from that. So I don't think banks will become obsolete, because banks are obviously controlling sort of government issued currency, and therefore banking will always remain. There will always be that real estate sector. There will always be that aspect. In relation to understanding, I think there is a need for the banking sector to understand the elements of being able to track and trace virtual currencies, and to have that clear degree of understanding of that, which will then allow them to move forward in that space. I'm not quite sure I hit all the points there.
Yeah, I think you did. Alex, you want to jump in?
When it comes to crypto assets, absolutely not.
The only thing Alex likes about cryptocurrency, Afsar, is when his Bitcoin raises in value. That's the only thing Alex likes about cryptocurrency.
There's another question on the 6 anti-money laundering directives, which is becoming effective in June 2021. How these new directives will address the shortfall of the existing one, and how efficient will it be in combating AML CFT?
Okay, so I'd have to have it literally in front of me to see what the differences are. I know there is a distinct difference in the aspect of virtual, because that is where recommendation 15 has been pulled from. So there is definite aspects around that, around virtual asset service providers and ATMs. Without having it in front of me, Afzar, I don't want to say to you that's a change and that's a change. Obviously, the directives are brought in internationally to assist in that anti-money laundering regime. So they are looking at the trends and the patterns moving forward in a way of trying to combat money laundering and terrorism financing. But without having it literally in front of me, I don't want to give you the differences. Alex, can you remember?
I'm the same as you. I don't have it in front of me. So I won't be able to give you chapter and verse on it now. Sorry.
Okay. A lot of the questions are again on what does Mauritius needs to do to get out of the blacklist. I think you have answered it by saying, it's not an overnight answer, and that as far as you and Alex are concerned, Mauritius is taking all the necessary steps and taking all the issues head on. Am I right on this?
Yeah, I think Mauritius are taking some really positive steps. Certainly, Alex and I are in regular conversation with different people in different sectors in Mauritius, and I think we as in Mauritius and the jurisdiction are going in the right direction. But as we quite clearly said, it's not an overnight. It's probably slowed down slightly because of the pandemic.
Okay. There's one very interesting question. I think it involves a lot of risks as well. Should banks who very often use mystery shopper to ascertain their level of customer service. Should banks start using mystery shopper for money laundering to test their own system?
It's quite an interesting one, is that, Afsar? And just before I let Alex sort of have his comment, I don't want to talk about the UK, but we do some work with in the UK with some of the banking sectors around simulation of accounts. So whereby accounts are simulated to, you create an account that would have the patterns that would relate to human trafficking, or would have patterns that would relate to drug supply, or patterns in relation to terrorism financing. And you simulate those accounts and ascertain then if the banks pick those up. So that's almost a little bit like a mystery shopper, whereby you can simulate an account into the patterns and the trends that is undertaken in some criminality, like money laundering, and see if that is then picked up in suspicious transaction reporting. So rather than having a mystery shopper, rather than having somebody walking with a bag of cash, you can do that background work on simulation of accounts. Alex?
No, I agree, but I think, in a very basic answer, you only know if a system works if it's tested. Whether it's via a mystery shopper, I'm not so sure. But I think what Andy is saying is entirely right, that those sort of tests of the system need to be carried out to make sure that everyone is doing what they should be doing in their compliance.
Okay. Now there's a question from a foreign investor who has invested in Mauritius. He's saying that he invested here because of the good image and the ease of doing business in Mauritius. But then the administration behind KYC, accounts opening, and everything that falls into it seems to defeat that image of ease of doing business. How do you reconcile the two?
I think Mauritius is strong for external investment and for international trade. I think it is right that Mauritius undertake the KYC that they do and the customer due diligence. And I think as an external investor coming into somewhere like Mauritius, that would fill me with confidence if the bank was asking for source of wealth, KYC, customer due diligence, enhanced due diligence, ultimate beneficial owner. I would feel confident as an external investor coming in if I knew that the banks had those regulations and policies in place to ask the right question. So I think that just assists in confidence rather than, I don't see it as a hurdle. I see it more as an aspect of confidence. I think if I was going into a country and investing and they asked me for nothing, then that, for me as an external investor, that would give me some red flags. So I think by the banks asking the right question, I think that's positive steps. Alex, do you agree with that?
Absolutely, I think it would instill confidence rather than any fear. So I would, as an external international investor, I'd want to have confidence in the system in which I'm placing my money or my assets. So yeah, I agree with everything Andy said.
Do you have any views how to increase the quality of financial reporting from the media? Because money laundering cases are complex, but the journalist seems to be happy with just the headlines. And then, there's no depth inside the article. How can we get the journalists to do better reporting?
I think the press and journalists play a role for us in the regulated sector and the law enforcement arena, and can greatly assist because ultimately, as we've been saying all today, the aim is to strip the assets and to ensure that criminals do not benefit. So we as a regulated sector, we do what we need to do. We as a law enforcement sector, we do what we need to do. We prosecute, we go to the judiciary, we take a confiscation. We are then looking at that being finished off with assistance from the media and journalists in reporting that and reporting it to our customers, our client base, members of the public and our community, to show that actually we are taking these steps to protect you. We are doing these steps and these investigations to protect you. And ultimately, as a result of that, we have managed to recover X amount of funds from a criminal organised crime group, and those funds will now be used for will go to the state, or will be put towards further law enforcement or regulated sectors, or put to things for members of the public. So I think journalists and the media play a huge role in sort of painting the picture of positivity around money laundering convictions. And I think that positive aspect that journalists can help us then creates further positivity, whereby our customer base are strong, they feel confident in using us, and also they feel confident in reporting persons who they perceive to be money laundering.
I think also that there's a role to be played by press liaison officers if it is a press release coming from an enforcement authority, that they have that relationship with editors of local press to ensure that the correct details of an enforcement investigation or action is reported appropriately.
I've got another question on, I think this one is more for Alex. The Financial Intelligence Unit has raised a query on an account with the bank, which the bank onboarded the client about 3-4 years ago, and they were satisfied with all the KYCs. Now they got a query from the Financial Intelligence Units about potential criminal activities, but they were satisfied with the KYC done so far. How can they terminate the relationship, or should they terminate the relationship first? And if yes, how can they do it without tipping off the client?
Without knowing the facts of it, it's very difficult to give an opinion on it. I think from what you're saying, the bank has complied with their compliance regulations. They've filed information with the FIU, and the FIU are now further down the line conducting an investigation. That there's nothing, I don't see anything abnormal in that. They may well have discovered from the suspicious transaction report through their analysis, they may have discovered further information, but without knowing the suspicion of the criminality or the terrorist financing, whatever it is, what the bank should do. That's a pretty open and difficult question to answer. But what I go back to is that the bank should follow its own internal policies and procedures and ensure what they're doing is in line with their perceived risk and how they deal with it.
I've got another one from an offshore management company. They got the clients which have been with them for a long time. They have, satisfied with the KYC, but when they do the review annually, they found in one company within the group where the KYC raised some red flags. So they reported the matter to FIU, they filed the STR. But when the FSC came back, it closed all the group's companies as opposed to just the one that they have had some concern. And they feel sometimes that the response to an issue gets a bit heavy-handed. Some people don't do anything, and when they do, it's a heavy-handed approach. How can the regulator get the right balance?
I think there needs to be a two-way street, Afsar, in that as well. Obviously, they've reported the suspicion of the one company. There's been some red flags raised, and quite appropriately, they've then reported that, which in turn has led to the whole being closed down and being shut down. So I think there is a little bit of a two-way street in the fact that we should be feeding back. Information should also go back to the banks and to the regulated sector, be that in a quarterly or an annual report suggesting these, not necessarily specific cases, but referring to generality of cases and saying this is why we then chose to close it down. If it is a large case, then we would expect, or we would hope, that law enforcement would also push back in that same two-way street and say, well, actually, the move forward is this because. So I think there's definitely a two-way street, and there needs to be an aspect whereby decisions are explained better. We ask for regulated sector to improve the quality of their suspicious transaction reports, but they can't improve any quality of their transaction reporting if we don't feed back to say what that quality needs to be, or this report was really good, etc. So I think it's the aspect of trying to improve, and it's coming back to aspects where Alex mentioned about joint working and that joint working relationship. if we have that joint working relationship, that will definitely improve communication, which hopefully would assist in aspects like that.
Andy and Alex, I think we are sailing close to the time. In my personal name, I would like to thank you. But before that, I would like to have a closing remark from each one of you.
Alex is on mute, so I get to go first. From a closing remark from me, I think is a very simple one. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for attending. And thank you for being part of this conference and allowing Alex and I to speak. I know that we've only had a short period of time to discuss a lot, and I am aware that there are a number of questions that we've not been able to address. Certainly, Alex and I will be coming out to Mauritius very shortly. We do work alongside Abler, and it's been a pleasure to work with Shahana now for a short period of time, but hopefully what will improve to be a long period of time. So as we work alongside Abler, we would encourage you to reach out to us if we can assist you in any way possible. Then I am more than happy to take a phone call. Please don't ring me like Shahana does at 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning, but I am more than happy to take a call at any time, as Alex would be. But sort of a closing note is, thank you very much for your time. For those of you who are disheartened about the grey listing, don't be. Mauritius are going in the right direction completely. Thank you very much. Alex?
Yeah, just to reiterate what Andy said, thank you very much for allowing us to talk or to give this presentation today. It's been very enjoyable. What I would say quite simply is keep up the good fights. Keep working in your sectors, complying with the regulations, expand your knowledge. There's plenty of information out there on the web and also from various consultancies and advisory services. If you do need to make contact, please do. But it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Andy. Final word, Shana. The floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, Alex, Afsar, and Andy. That was really a very interesting and enlightening discussion. And I hope everyone attending now has a clearer understanding of the AML safety compliance. We have been receiving really great comments. So thank you everyone for being with us today. And I hope that you have all drawn good value from this webinar discussions. This series of thought leadership is a first for Abler. We are indeed motivated by today's huge participation and are already looking forward to organizing more webinars in the very near future. Like Andy mentioned, Alex and Andy will be with us in Mauritius for a series of training as soon as the lockdown is lifted. We will share more information about the trainings in due course, and trust me, I believe this will be highly beneficial for all of us here. From me, Afsar, Alex, Andy, my Abler team and partners, it is bye for now from us. Please stay in, stay safe, and stay in touch with Abler Consulting. Thank you very much.